I was 17 at the time, restless with the particular brand of boredom that afflicts teenagers in the digital age. My grandparents owned a sprawling ranch nestled among the pine-covered slopes of the Rim Mountains in Arizona. The property featured their main house, a sturdy two-story log structure, and 7 smaller rental cabins scattered throughout the property, each positioned to offer privacy and stunning views of the wilderness. During spring and summer, my family would visit regularly, enjoying hikes through wildflower-filled meadows and cool evenings under star-filled skies. But winter visits were rare. The mountain roads became treacherous. Heavy snow isolated the ranch and temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Yet that February, my parents decided we needed a family getaway. "It'll be good to disconnect," my father said, eyes fixed on the road as our SUV climbed higher into the mountains. "No internet, minimal cell service, just family time." My brother Andrew, 10 years my senior, sat in the back seat with his wife Joanna and their children, 4-year-old Emma and 2-year-old Ben. My cousin Nell was squeezed between the child seats, her attention fixed on a dog-eared paperback. "Weather report says we might get another 8 inches tonight," Mom commented, studying her phone before the signal disappeared entirely. The SUV's wipers fought against the thickening snowfall as we made the final turn onto the unmarked gravel road leading to the ranch. The snow muffled everything, creating that particular winter silence that feels both peaceful and somehow watchful. Our tires crunched over the fresh powder as we pulled up to the main house. Grandpa Russell stood on the porch, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat, breath visible in the cold air. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as we tumbled out of the vehicle, stiff from the 3-hour drive. "Perfect timing," he called out, helping us with our bags. "Your grandmother just pulled a venison stew off the stove." Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Grandma June welcomed us with firm hugs, her silver hair pulled back in her usual neat bun. The familiar surroundings, antler chandeliers, well-worn leather furniture, and walls lined with family photos, created an immediate sense of comfort. After dinner, as the adults talked around the fireplace, I watched the snow intensify outside the large picture window. The flakes grew larger, illuminated by the porch lights, swirling in hypnotic patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Something about their movement made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. "You and Nell will be staying in Pine Cabin," Grandma informed me, breaking my trance. "We've got the heater running already." Pine Cabin was the closest of the rental cabins to the main house, though still a good 100 yards through the woods. I nodded, unaware that this routine arrangement would become anything but ordinary. Morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The ranch transformed overnight into a winter wonderland, with snow-laden pine branches creating natural archways along the paths between cabins. After breakfast, Andrew suggested we build an igloo for the kids. "I've never seen snow this perfect for packing," he said, demonstrating by forming a perfect snowball with minimal effort. We spent hours in childlike play, crafting a surprisingly sturdy snow structure while Emma and Ben squealed with delight. Yet throughout the day, I noticed Grandpa frequently scanning the tree line, his expression unreadable. Once I caught him staring intently at something in the distance, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that always hung above the kitchen door when we visited. "Everything okay?" I asked. He blinked, as if returning from deep thought. "Just keeping an eye out. Had some trouble with predators lately, probably just coyotes getting bold with the harsh winter." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't being entirely forthcoming. I noticed he'd been talking in hushed tones with my father and Andrew, conversations that abruptly shifted when anyone else approached. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered again, promising more snow. The temperature dropped noticeably, and we retreated indoors for hot chocolate and board games. I observed subtle changes in the adults' behavior, the way they tensed at unexpected sounds, how they checked door locks twice, the flashlights and radios placed strategically near entrances. "What's really going on?" I finally asked my mother as she prepared sandwich plates for dinner. She hesitated, knife suspended above the bread. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just stay close to the cabins after dark, okay?" Nell suggested we continue our marathon of board games after dinner, but I declined, feeling unusually fatigued from the day's activities and the altitude. "I think I'll head back to the cabin early," I said, suppressing a yawn. I need to finish the book I started. I'll come with you, Nell offered, but Grandma interrupted. Actually, Nell, would you mind helping me organize some photo albums? I've been meaning to sort through them, and your eye for detail would be appreciated. The request seemed oddly timed, but Nell agreed. I'll join you later then, she told me. Don't fall asleep with the light on like last time. As I prepared to leave, Grandpa handed me a powerful flashlight. Stay on the path, he instructed firmly, and lock the door behind you. The intensity in his eyes made me pause. Is there something I should know? He squeezed my shoulder. Just being cautious. The mountains demand respect, especially in winter. The path to Pine Cabin was well marked with solar lights, but darkness had descended completely, rendering them little more than dim beacons in a sea of black. The moon remained hidden behind thick clouds, and the snowfall had resumed, gentler now, but persistent. My flashlight carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the darkness. Beyond its beam, the forest was an impenetrable wall of shadow. Every few steps, I would swing the light in a wide arc, illuminating sections of woods that immediately returned to darkness once the beam passed. The temperature had plummeted further, creating that peculiar silence unique to extreme cold, a silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than merely lack it. My boots crunched rhythmically in the fresh powder, the noise unnaturally loud against the backdrop of nothing. Halfway to the cabin, I stopped. Not consciously, not with any clear thought. My body simply ceased moving, as if responding to some primal warning system buried deep in my evolutionary past. The hairs on my arms and neck rose simultaneously, and my breath caught in my throat. I was being watched. Slowly, I turned in a complete circle, sweeping the flashlight beam across the surrounding forest. The light reflected off snow-covered branches and created strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to. Yet the feeling of observation intensified. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vast darkness. No response came save for a distant cracking sound, perhaps a branch giving way under the weight of accumulated snow, perhaps something else entirely. I quickened my pace, no longer concerned with appearing afraid. Pine Cabin materialized from the darkness like a sanctuary, its windows glowing with the warm light I'd left on before dinner. I practically ran the final yards, fumbled with the key, and burst inside, slamming the door behind me and engaging both the deadbolt and the secondary chain lock. The cabin's interior offered immediate comfort: a queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt, a small bathroom, a writing desk beneath the window, and a comfortable reading chair. A skylight above the bed would normally offer stargazing opportunities, but tonight showed only darkness and occasional snowflakes. I tried to shake off my unease, attributing it to an overactive imagination fueled by the adult's mysterious behavior. After washing up and changing into warm pajamas, I settled onto the bed with my Kindle, determined to lose myself in a novel rather than dwell on formless fears. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 9:37 p.m. Nell would likely arrive within the hour, and I looked forward to her company. Until then, I immersed myself in my book, gradually relaxing as the fictional world pulled me away from my surroundings. Until the sound. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all, perhaps just the wind or snow sliding from the roof. But then it came again. A low, rumbling sound, not quite a growl, but something deeper, more deliberate. It emanated from directly behind me, from the other side of the window above the headboard. My entire body tensed. The sound came again, louder this time, impossible to dismiss as anything natural or familiar. With trembling hands, I set my Kindle aside and slowly turned toward the window. What I saw will forever be etched in my memory. Pressed against the glass was a face, or something approximating a face. In the dim light, I could make out features that resembled a wolf: elongated snout, pointed ears, glinting eyes that reflected an unnatural yellow in the cabin light. But the proportions were wrong, the size impossibly large for any canine native to these mountains. I remained frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The creature's breath fogged the glass in rhythmic pulses, creating and dispelling small circles of condensation. We stared at each other for what felt like eternity, though it could only have been seconds. Then it moved. A limb rose into view. Not a paw, but something horrifyingly in between animal and human. Fingers too long, joints too numerous, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of shredding metal. This impossible appendage pressed flat against the window, spreading wide as if measuring the barrier's strength. I scrambled backward off the bed, nearly falling in my haste. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The window this creature peered through was at least 7 feet off the ground on the outside, where the cabin was built into the sloping mountainside. For its face to be visible required it to stand upright at a height no natural animal could achieve. The claws began to drag downward, creating a sound so grating and deliberate it seemed designed to unnerve. The screech of keratin against glass sent waves of revulsion through my body. I watched, paralyzed, as it traced what appeared to be deliberate patterns, not random scratches, but something with purpose. Then, abruptly, the face withdrew from the window. I heard heavy movement outside, something large circling the cabin with slow, measured steps. Occasional scrapes against the wooden exterior suggested it was testing the structure, searching for weakness. With horror, I realized I had left the front door unlocked for Nell. Adrenaline finally broke my paralysis. I lunged for the door, my stockinged feet sliding on the wooden floor. My hands fumbled with the deadbolt, finally engaging it with a solid click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. I added the chain lock as well, though it suddenly seemed flimsy protection against whatever circled outside. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, cursing as I saw the single bar of reception flickering uncertainly. Mountain service was always spotty, but the snowstorm made it worse. I dialed my mother's number with shaking fingers, praying the call would connect. Outside, something heavy impacted the side of the cabin. Not a casual brush, but a deliberate strike that made the entire structure shudder. The lights flickered momentarily, plunging the cabin into darkness before humming back to life. The call connected just as another blow struck the cabin, this one powerful enough to knock a framed landscape from the wall. It crashed to the floor, glass shattering. "Mom!" I screamed into the phone as soon as I heard her voice. "Something's trying to get in. There's something outside the cabin." Her response was immediate. "Stay away from the windows. We're coming." Another impact, this time against the door itself. The wood creaked ominously, and I could hear the deadbolt rattling in its housing. Whatever was out there understood doors, understood locks. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. "Hurry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if she could still hear me. The phone showed the call had dropped. I retreated to the bathroom, the only space without windows, clutching the flashlight Grandpa had given me like a talisman. Outside, the creature continued its methodical assault on the cabin, testing different entry points with frightening intelligence. The minutes stretched endlessly as I huddled against the bathtub, ears straining for any sound that might indicate help was coming. When the distant rumble of an engine finally penetrated the noise of the assault, the relief was so intense I nearly collapsed. The creature's reaction to the approaching vehicle was immediate. The assault on the cabin ceased, replaced by what sounded like rapid movement through the snow. I heard the growl of my grandfather's truck drawing closer, its headlights briefly illuminating the bathroom through the crack beneath the door. "Riley!" My grandfather's voice called out, deep and authoritative. "Are you in there?" I burst from the bathroom, still clutching the flashlight. "I'm here. Don't come in without a weapon." Through the window beside the door, I could see my grandfather, father, and 2 uncles, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter, all armed with hunting rifles. My grandfather carried his prized Remington 700, a serious weapon he used for elk hunting. They formed a protective semicircle, scanning the surroundings with practiced movements that spoke of military training from their younger days. "Unlock the door, Riley," my father called. "Quick now." I disengaged the locks with trembling hands and nearly fell into my father's arms as he entered. Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter remained outside, rifles raised, moving in slow circles as they surveyed the darkness beyond the cabin's immediate vicinity. "What happened?" Dad asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. The words tumbled out in a confused rush. The face at the window, the hand that wasn't a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses. As I spoke, Grandpa examined the window where I'd first seen the creature. "Look here," he said grimly, pointing his flashlight. In the beam, deep scratches were visible in the wooden frame surrounding the glass. Not random damage, but deliberate markings that almost resembled crude symbols. Uncle Peter called from outside. "Russell, you need to see this." We joined them, my father keeping a protective arm around my shoulders. Uncle Peter's flashlight illuminated the snow beneath the elevated side of the cabin, the side where I'd seen the creature at the window. Imprinted in the fresh powder were tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They resembled wolf prints in their general shape, but were massively oversized, each easily larger than my grandfather's outstretched hand. More disturbing were the inconsistencies in their formation, sometimes showing distinct toe pads like a canine, other times displaying what looked disturbingly like elongated finger marks. "What made these?" I whispered. The four men exchanged looks heavy with meaning. Grandpa's weathered face was grim in the harsh flashlight beam. "We need to get back to the main house," he said instead of answering. "Now." As we hurried along the path, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter positioned themselves at the front and rear of our group, rifles ready. My father and grandfather flanked me, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness between the trees. "There's something you should see," Grandpa said quietly as we walked. He directed his flashlight toward a massive pine about 20 feet off the path. Deep gouges marred its trunk, vertical scrapes that extended upward far beyond the reach of a standing man, at least 20 feet high. "Found these 3 days ago," he continued. "Similar marks on trees throughout the property. Game cameras keep getting destroyed before we can retrieve any footage." "What is it?" I asked, voice barely audible over the crunching snow beneath our boots. "Don't know for certain," Grandpa admitted. "But it's big, it's smart, and it's not natural to these mountains." The main house was ablaze with light when we arrived, every exterior lamp illuminated, casting harsh shadows across the snow-covered yard. Mom rushed out to meet us, wrapping me in a fierce embrace before ushering me inside where Grandma, Nell, Andrew, Joanna, and the children waited anxiously. Emma and Ben had been put to bed in the upstairs guest room, mercifully unaware of the tension permeating the house. The adults gathered in the kitchen, voices low but urgent. "I told you it was escalating," Grandpa said to my father. "This isn't random wildlife behavior." Uncle Peter placed his rifle on the kitchen table, a breach of Grandma's usual house rules that she didn't comment on. "We should call Fish and Wildlife again." "They didn't take us seriously last time," Uncle Daniel countered. "Suggested it was just a particularly large black bear, despite the evidence." "What exactly is happening here?" Nell demanded, her usual composure frayed. "What was out there?" Grandpa sighed heavily, exchanging glances with Grandma before addressing us all. "Something's been stalking the property for about 3 weeks now. Started with missing chickens, then one of the barn cats disappeared. Last week, we found one of the yearling calves dead in the north pasture, not killed for food, just torn apart." "And you didn't think to warn us before we came up here?" Mom's voice held a sharp edge. "We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily," Grandma interjected. "Russell thought it might move on once the weather improved. Predators get desperate during hard winters." "This isn't desperation," I said, all eyes turning to me. "Whatever I saw was intelligent. It was testing the cabin, looking for ways in. And those scratches on the window frame, they looked deliberate, like it was marking territory." A heavy silence followed my words. Grandpa nodded slowly. "Riley's right. This isn't normal predator behavior." "I've called the ranger station," Uncle Daniel announced, returning from the living room where he'd been on the landline. "They're sending someone first thing tomorrow, but with the snow, it could be midday before they arrive." Grandpa loaded shells into his shotgun with practiced efficiency. "We'll take watches through the night, 2-hour shifts, pairs at all times. Peter and I will take first watch. Daniel and Andrew second, then John and I will take the pre-dawn hours." No one argued with the arrangement. The women and I were tasked with checking all windows and doors, ensuring every possible entry point was secured. The ranch house was built with security in mind. Solid oak doors, reinforced frames, windows that could be barricaded if necessary. As we worked, I described in greater detail what I'd seen at the cabin. The more I spoke, the more I realized how difficult it was to accurately convey the wrongness of the creature, how it seemed to occupy an unsettling middle ground between wolf and human, between animal instinct and calculated intelligence. "I've heard stories," Grandma said quietly, as we checked the latches on the living room windows. "Old tales from the indigenous people who lived in these mountains long before European settlers arrived. Stories about creatures that walk between forms, that hunt not just for sustenance, but for sport." You think that's what's out there? I asked, skepticism warring with the vivid memory of what I'd seen. She shook her head. I think there are things in these mountains that defy easy explanation, things that modern science hasn't cataloged. Whether it's an undiscovered species or something else entirely, I can't say. Sleep was impossible for most of us that night. I dozed fitfully on the living room sofa, jerking awake at every creak of the old house, every whispered conversation between the men as they changed watch shifts. Through the window, I could see them patrolling the perimeter of the house, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, rifles held ready. Sometime in the early morning hours, I was startled fully awake by urgent voices on the back porch. Uncle Peter and my father were speaking rapidly, their breath visible in the pre-dawn air as I peered through the window. Circled the entire property, Uncle Peter was saying. Multiple sets of tracks, all the same type. How many? Dad asked, his voice tight. Hard to be certain, at least 3 distinct individuals, based on the stride length and depth. I felt my stomach drop. Not one creature, but several. A pack. Dawn arrived with painful slowness, the sky transitioning from black to deep blue to a pale, washed-out gray that offered little comfort. The snowfall had stopped, but heavy clouds remained, promising more before the day's end. No one had encountered anything during the night watches, though Uncle Daniel reported hearing something large moving through the trees around 3 a.m. Nothing had approached the house directly. After a tense breakfast that no one had much appetite for, Grandpa, Uncle Peter, and my father prepared to visit Pine Cabin in daylight to retrieve our belongings and examine the damage more thoroughly. Andrew would remain at the main house with Uncle Daniel to protect the rest of the family. I want to come too, I insisted. I should see it in daylight. After some debate, they reluctantly agreed, provided I stayed close and followed instructions without question. We armed ourselves, the men with rifles, me with Grandpa's heavy maglite that could double as a club if necessary, and set out along the now familiar path. Daylight transformed the forest, rendering it ordinary, almost disappointingly benign after the terrors of the night. The tracks, however, told a different story. In the harsh clarity of morning, they were even more disturbing, massive prints that followed our path from the main house to the cabin with unsettling precision, veering off occasionally to circle trees or investigate other cabins, but always returning to the main trail. Pine Cabin looked surprisingly intact from the outside, though deep gouges marred the wooden siding in several places. The most concentrated damage was around the windows and door, points of potential entry. Something tried very hard to get in, Uncle Peter observed, running his fingers along scratches in the doorframe that had splintered the solid oak. Inside, I collected my belongings while the men examined the cabin methodically. Grandpa took photographs with a digital camera, documenting the damage for the authorities and insurance purposes. Look at this pattern, Dad called from the window, where I'd first seen the creature. He pointed to the scratches in the wooden frame, which upon closer inspection did indeed form a distinct pattern, 3 vertical lines intersected by 2 horizontal ones. It's on the doorframe too, Uncle Peter noted, and here, by the bathroom window. Grandpa's expression grew increasingly troubled as we found the same marking repeated throughout the cabin. This isn't random damage. As we prepared to leave, a truck with Forest Service markings pulled up outside. 2 uniformed rangers emerged, a tall, bearded man in his 50s and a younger woman with sharp eyes that immediately began assessing the scene. Russell, the older ranger, greeted my grandfather with a firm handshake. Wish we were meeting under better circumstances. I'm taking your reports a lot more seriously after what happened at the Nelson property. Nelson property? Grandpa's voice sharpened. What happened? The rangers exchanged glances. You haven't heard? 3 nights ago, about 15 miles northeast of here, family of 4. Their vacation cabin was broken into. Parents killed, children missing. Signs of large predator activity, but what? My father pressed. But inconsistent with known predator behavior, the female ranger finished. Door was forced open, not clawed through, food left untouched, and markings on the walls and door frames similar to what I'm seeing here. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The creatures I'd seen weren't just curious or territorial. They were actively hunting humans. While the adults continued their grim conversation, I wandered a short distance from the cabin, needing space to process this new information. The forest seemed to press in around me, no longer benign despite the daylight. A flash of color caught my eye, something red against the pristine white snow about 20 yards from the cabin. Curious, I moved closer, discovering a torn piece of fabric snagged on a low branch. It looked like part of a child's winter coat, the material expensive and relatively new. "Grandpa," I called, holding up my discovery. "I found something." The rangers were particularly interested in the fabric, placing it carefully in an evidence bag. "This matches the description of what one of the Nelson children was wearing," the female ranger confirmed, her expression grim. Further search of the area revealed more disturbing findings, additional tracks showing what appeared to be something large dragging a heavy object through the snow, small items of children's clothing, and most chillingly, a distinct trail leading deeper into the forest toward the most remote regions of the mountain range. "We need to organize a proper search party," the male ranger decided, already on his radio calling for backup. "If there's any chance those children are still alive." We returned to the main house in somber silence, the implications of our discoveries weighing heavily on everyone. The rangers' backup would arrive within hours, bringing additional personnel, tracking dogs, and more comprehensive equipment. Grandpa insisted we pack immediately and leave before noon. "This isn't our fight now," he said firmly. "The authorities are taking over, and I want my family safely off this mountain." No one argued. Even Grandma, who typically hated leaving her home, was already packing essentials into well-worn suitcases. We were ready to leave within the hour, vehicles packed and children secured in their car seats. The rangers had established a command post at the main house, additional Forest Service and Sheriff's Department vehicles arriving in a steady stream. Men and women in uniform moved with purposeful efficiency, unloading equipment and consulting topographical maps spread across Grandpa's kitchen table. As we prepared to depart, the female ranger approached me. "I'd like to get a formal statement from you," she said. "You're the only one who saw these creatures clearly." In the stark daylight of the kitchen, surrounded by law enforcement professionals, I felt suddenly self-conscious about my account. Would they believe me? Would they dismiss what I'd seen as the overactive imagination of a frightened teenager? But as I described the events of the previous night, the face at the window, the hand that wasn't quite a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses, I saw recognition in the ranger's eyes. "This matches other reports we've received," she confirmed when I finished. "Isolated incidents over the past decade, but increasing in frequency and boldness over the last 6 months." "What are they?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since the previous night. She hesitated. "Officially, unknown predator species, possibly wolves with genetic abnormalities or bears with unusual behavior patterns." Her voice lowered. "Unofficially, something that shouldn't exist. Something that's evolving, adapting, learning how to hunt us more effectively." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Will you find those children?" Her expression turned grim. "We'll try. But given what we know about these creatures' behavior patterns..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As we finally drove away from the ranch, I watched through the rear window as the collection of emergency vehicles grew smaller in the distance. The mountain itself seemed to loom over them, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. 3 weeks later, the official search for the Nelson children was called off. The official report cited animal predation as the cause of the parents' deaths. The children were presumed dead, though their bodies were never recovered. Grandpa and Grandma sold the ranch that spring, moving to a retirement community in Phoenix. None of us ever returned to the mountains. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I still wake suddenly with the certainty that something is watching me through my bedroom window. I lie perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting for the sound of claws against glass. The mountains keep their secrets well, but sometimes those secrets venture down into the world of humans, hungry for more than just flesh. They hunger for our fear, our confusion, our desperate need to categorize and understand. Some things defy understanding. Some predators have learned that humans are easy prey when isolated, when comfortable in their perceived safety. Be cautious when you venture into remote places. Pay attention to the warnings your body gives you, that primal fear response that preceded civilization, that tension along your spine that tells you you're being hunted. And if you ever find yourself alone in a cabin in the wilderness and feel eyes upon you from the darkness beyond your windows, do not assume the barrier between you and what watches is sufficient protection. Lock your doors, stay vigilant, and remember that we have never been the apex predator we believe ourselves to be. God help you if you ever see what I saw that night. The memory alone is enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place within it. Some watchers should remain unseen. The summer of 1987 stretched endlessly before me, filled with the promise of freedom that only a 10-year-old could truly appreciate. I lived in rural Indiana, where cornfields stretched like green oceans in every direction, and the nearest neighbor was close enough to borrow sugar but far enough away to mind their own business. Our small town of Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner served coffee that could wake the dead, and where the biggest excitement usually came from the high school football games or the annual corn festival. That particular Saturday in July started like any other. The morning air was thick with humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin, and the cicadas had already begun their relentless buzzing symphony in the trees. My older brother Timothy was scheduled to play in a travel baseball tournament 2 towns over in Millfield, and I was expected to tag along as usual. At 15, Timothy was the star pitcher of our local team, and my parents never missed one of his games. I remember feeling restless that morning, the way children do when they're forced to sit still for too long. The thought of spending 3 hours on those splintered wooden bleachers, pretending to care about strikes and balls, made my stomach churn with boredom. But there was no getting out of it. Family was family, and in our house that meant showing up for each other no matter what. The drive to Millfield took 45 minutes through winding country roads lined with farmhouses and barns that had seen better decades. My father drove our old Ford pickup, its air conditioning long since broken, while my mother fanned herself with a church bulletin. The radio crackled with static, playing country music that seemed to fade in and out like a ghost trying to communicate. As we pulled into the dusty parking lot beside the baseball diamond, I could see families already gathering, coolers full of ice-cold drinks, folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, and children running around with the boundless energy that adults envied. The smell of grilled hot dogs and hamburgers wafted through the air from the concession stand, mixing with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint odor of livestock from nearby farms. The baseball field itself was nothing special, just a patch of maintained grass surrounded by a chain-link fence, with those notorious pine bleachers that had given me splinters more times than I could count. Behind the field, about 100 yards away, stood a playground that looked like it had been installed sometime in the 1970s. The equipment was sturdy but weathered, painted in colors that had faded under years of harsh summer sun. What caught my attention immediately was the tree line that bordered the entire area. Dense woods stretched back as far as the eye could see, creating a natural wall of green that seemed to swallow the horizon. Something about those trees felt different from the familiar woods around our home. They seemed darker somehow, more secretive, as if they were hiding something important just beyond where anyone could see. Timothy jogged onto the field with his teammates, his uniform crisp and clean, his glove well-oiled and ready for action. I watched him take his practice throws, noting the confidence in his movements, the easy way he commanded respect from the other players. Part of me felt proud to be his little brother, but another part felt the familiar sting of inadequacy that came from always being in someone else's shadow. The game began with the usual fanfare. The national anthem played through a crackling PA system, followed by the ceremonial first pitch thrown by the mayor of Millfield, a heavyset man whose claim to fame was winning the county fair pie-eating contest 3 years running. As the opposing team took their positions, I tried to settle in for what I knew would be a long afternoon, but my attention kept wandering to that playground behind the field. I could see children my age running around, their laughter carrying across the distance like music. They seemed to be having actual fun, unlike the adults who sat rigidly in their chairs, shouting instructions that the players couldn't hear and keeping score in little notebooks as if their lives depended on it. By the 3rd inning, my restlessness had reached a breaking point. The sun was beating down mercilessly, and the wooden bleacher beneath me felt like it was slowly cooking my legs through my jeans. When I asked my father if I could go play on the playground, He barely looked up from his scorecard before nodding absently. "Stay where I can see you," he said, his eyes never leaving the field where Timothy was preparing to pitch. I practically flew off those bleachers, my feet hitting the ground with a satisfying thump. The walk to the playground felt like a journey to freedom, each step taking me further away from the tedious world of adult expectations and closer to the simple joy of just being a kid. As I got closer, I could hear the specific sounds of childhood play, the creak of swing set chains, the hollow thump of feet on metal slides, and the rapid-fire chatter of children lost in their own imaginary worlds. The playground was more crowded than it had appeared from a distance. Kids of all ages scrambled over the equipment like busy ants, their energy infectious and immediate. I recognized a few faces from other baseball teams in our league, children I'd seen at previous tournaments, but never really talked to. There was something liberating about being in a place where nobody knew exactly who I was or what was expected of me. I threw myself into the playground activities with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who had been trapped in adult world for far too long. I climbed the monkey bars until my palms were raw, raced down the twisting slide until the static electricity made my hair stand on end, and joined an impromptu game of tag that stretched across every piece of equipment in the area. The other children were welcoming in the way that kids can be when they're all united in the common goal of having fun. We invented elaborate games on the spot, created alliances that lasted for minutes before dissolving into new configurations, and shared the kind of laughter that comes from deep in your belly and bubbles up without warning. For a while, I forgot completely about the baseball game happening behind me. I forgot about Timothy and his perfect pitching form, about my parents keeping careful score, about the expectations that seemed to follow me everywhere I went. In that playground, surrounded by children who didn't know or care about any of that, I was just a kid playing in the summer sun. But even in that moment of pure childhood joy, something felt slightly off. Maybe it was the way the trees behind the playground seemed to lean inward, as if they were listening to our games. Maybe it was the occasional shadow that moved differently than it should have among the branches. Or maybe it was just the natural wariness that some children develop early, a sixth sense that warns them when something isn't quite right. Whatever it was, I found myself glancing toward those woods more often than I probably should have. Each time I looked, they seemed a little darker, a little more mysterious. And each time I turned back to the game, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in those trees was looking back at me. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the crowd on the playground gradually thinned out. Some children were called back to their families for snacks or bathroom breaks. Others simply grew tired of the games and wandered off to explore different areas of the park. By the time the baseball game entered its sixth inning, only about half a dozen of us remained actively playing. That's when he appeared. I first noticed him standing at the edge of the playground, just beyond the safety zone of wood chips and painted equipment. He was older than the rest of us, definitely a teenager, maybe 17 or 18 years old. Tall and lean, with curly brown hair that caught the late afternoon sunlight in a way that made it look almost golden. His clothes were casual but clean, faded jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days but wasn't dirty or torn. What struck me most about him was his smile. It was the kind of smile that seemed genuine and friendly, the sort that immediately made you want to trust the person wearing it. He had an easy, relaxed way of standing that suggested confidence without arrogance, and when he finally approached our group, his voice was warm and conversational. "Hey there," he said, addressing all of us, but somehow making it feel like he was speaking to each of us individually. "You guys having fun over here? I could hear you laughing from way over by the concession stand." The other children responded with the natural enthusiasm that kids show when an older, cooler person pays attention to them. They gathered around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, eager to share stories about their games and show off whatever playground skills they had mastered that afternoon. His name was Brett, or at least that's what he told us. He said he was visiting relatives in the area and had been watching the baseball game when he noticed our playground activities. He had a way of talking that made even the most mundane topics seem interesting, and he asked questions that made each of us feel important and heard. "I used to love playgrounds when I was your age," he said, settling down on one of the park benches in a way that brought him to our eye level. "But you know what I discovered when I got older? The really cool stuff isn't on the playground. It's out there. He gestured vaguely toward the tree line behind us. What kind of stuff? Asked Jenny, a freckled girl from the Millfield team who had been dominating the monkey bars all afternoon. Brett's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. Oh, all kinds of things. Hidden places that most people never find. Old buildings that have been abandoned for years. Sometimes you can find really interesting stuff in places like that. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make us all lean in closer. Actually, I know some pretty crazy stories about this area, stuff that happened right around here, not too far from where we're sitting right now. The effect was immediate and electric. Nothing captures a child's attention quite like the promise of scary stories, especially when they're told by someone old enough to be credible but young enough to still seem approachable. We formed a tight semicircle around Brett, our earlier games completely forgotten. What kind of stories? Asked Tommy, a boy from our own team who had a reputation for being braver than his size suggested. Brett looked around dramatically, as if checking to make sure no adults were close enough to overhear. The gesture was theatrical but effective. It made us all feel like we were being let in on something secret and important. Well, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. There's this old cabin up in those woods behind us. Been there for probably 50 years or more. Most people don't even know it exists because it's pretty well hidden. And the path to get there isn't marked or anything. He paused, letting the anticipation build. I found myself leaning forward unconsciously, drawn into his narrative despite myself. The story goes that there were these two brothers who lived in that cabin back in the 1960s. They inherited it from their father, who had built it as a hunting lodge. But these brothers, they didn't get along very well. In fact, they hated each other's guts. Brett's voice dropped even lower, forcing us to strain to hear every word. They fought about everything. Money, women, who was supposed to take care of their sick mother. But the worst fight they ever had was over this girl they both wanted to marry. She was supposedly the prettiest girl in 3 counties, and both brothers were absolutely crazy about her. The story continued, growing darker and more violent with each detail. Brett described how the brothers' arguments had escalated from shouting matches to physical fights, how they had eventually started threatening each other with farm tools and hunting equipment. He painted vivid pictures of their final confrontation when they had supposedly attacked each other with axes and shovels in a rage-fueled battle that left both of them dead. They say you can still see the bloodstains on the cabin walls, Brett concluded, his voice barely above a whisper. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, you can hear them still arguing, still fighting over that girl who never chose either one of them. The effect of his story was exactly what he had probably intended. Some of the younger children looked genuinely frightened, their eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and terror. Others seemed skeptical but intrigued, the way kids get when they're not sure whether to believe something but don't want to miss out on the excitement. As for me, I found myself caught somewhere between those two reactions. Part of me recognized that Brett was probably just telling tall tales, the kind of local legends that every small town seemed to accumulate over the years. But another part of me, the part that had been noticing those shadows in the trees all afternoon, wondered if there might be some truth to his story. "Have you ever been to this cabin?" asked Jenny, her voice carrying a note of challenge that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Brett smiled, that same warm, trustworthy smile. "Oh yeah, several times. It's actually not that hard to find once you know where to look. The hardest part is just working up the courage to go inside." He stood up from the bench, stretching casually as if the conversation had been nothing more than idle entertainment. "But I'm guessing you guys are probably too young for that kind of adventure. It's pretty scary, even for someone like me." The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. To a group of children who had spent the afternoon proving their bravery on playground equipment, the suggestion that they might be too scared for a real adventure was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. "We're not scared," Tommy declared, speaking for the group with the kind of bravado that 10-year-olds specialize in. "Maybe not," Brett said with a knowing smile. "But your parents probably wouldn't be too happy if they found out you were wandering off into the woods. And besides, it's getting pretty late in the day. The sun will be setting soon." As if summoned by his words, Several parents appeared at various points around the playground, calling for their children to return to the baseball game or gather their belongings for the trip home. One by one, my new playground friends began to drift away, pulled back into the orbit of family responsibilities and scheduled activities. Jenny waved goodbye as her mother led her toward their car. Tommy was summoned by his father to help carry a cooler to their truck. Within minutes, the playground that had been bustling with activity was nearly empty, which left just Brett and me, standing in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, with nothing but the distant sounds of the baseball game and the ever-present whisper of wind through the trees. "Well," Brett said, turning that charming smile directly on me, "I guess it's just you and me now." The playground felt eerily different with just the two of us there. What had seemed like a vibrant, safe space just minutes before now felt exposed and vulnerable. The equipment that had been so welcoming during the afternoon's games now cast long shadows that stretched toward the tree line like dark fingers reaching across the wood chips. Brett seemed completely at ease with the change in atmosphere. If anything, he appeared more relaxed now that the other children had left, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He settled back onto the park bench with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, even though something deep in my gut was starting to whisper that maybe he didn't. "So," he said, his voice maintaining that same friendly tone that had drawn us all in earlier, "what's your name? I don't think you mentioned it before." "Connor," I replied, though I immediately wondered if I should have given him a fake name instead. The thought surprised me. Where had that come from? This was just a friendly teenager who had been entertaining us with stories. There was no reason to be suspicious of him. "Connor," he repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. "That's a good, strong name. Irish, right? I bet you're tougher than you look." The compliment should have made me feel good, but instead it sent an odd chill through my chest. There was something about the way he said it that felt less like a casual observation and more like an assessment. The way someone might evaluate a piece of merchandise they were considering purchasing. "I should probably get back to the baseball game," I said, glancing over my shoulder toward the field where I could see my parents still sitting in the bleachers. They looked impossibly far away, even though the distance couldn't have been more than 100 yards. "Oh, come on," Brett said with a laugh that sounded forced around the edges. "The game's almost over anyway. Besides, don't you want to hear more about that cabin I was telling you about? I've got some really interesting details that I didn't want to share in front of the little kids." Despite every instinct telling me to walk away, I found myself curious about what he might tell me. There was something compelling about being treated like I was old enough to handle more mature information, something flattering about being singled out from the group for special attention. "What kind of details?" I asked, though I took a small step backward as I spoke, creating a little more distance between us. Brett's eyes lit up with apparent enthusiasm. "Well, for starters, those brothers I told you about? The story doesn't end with them just dying in that cabin. See, after they were found dead, some really strange things started happening in the area." He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Kids would go missing from this very playground, not all at once, and not in any pattern that people could figure out. Just one here, one there, always children who had wandered off by themselves." My mouth went dry. "What happened to them?" "Some of them were never found," Brett said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine sadness. "But the ones who did turn up, well, they were different, changed. They couldn't really explain what had happened to them, but they were never quite the same afterward." He stood up from the bench, moving slowly but purposefully in my direction. "The thing is, Connor, I think those missing kids were taken to that cabin. I think someone has been using it as a hiding place, a place where they could spend time with children without being interrupted." The way he said those words, "spend time with children," made my skin crawl. There was an implication in his tone that I couldn't quite grasp, but that my instincts recognized as dangerous. Every muscle in my body was suddenly tense, ready to run, though I couldn't have explained why. "I really should go back to my parents," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and normal. "They'll be wondering where I am." "Will they, though?" Brett asked, tilting his head slightly. "I've been watching for a while, and they seem pretty focused on that baseball game. I bet they haven't even looked over here in the last 30 minutes. The fact that he had been watching my family without my knowledge sent a spike of fear through my chest. How long had he been observing us? What else had he noticed that I hadn't been aware of? The thing about that cabin, Brett continued, taking another step closer, is that it's really not that far from here. Maybe a 10-minute walk through the woods. And I've been thinking it might be fun to show it to someone who's brave enough to appreciate it. I'm not really interested, I said, backing away more obviously now. Thanks anyway. But Brett's smile never wavered. Oh, I think you are interested. I think you're exactly the kind of kid who would love to see something that most people never get to experience. You seem different from those other children, more mature, more adventurous. There was something hypnotic about his voice, something that made it hard to think clearly. Part of me was terrified and wanted nothing more than to run back to the safety of my parents and the baseball game. But another part, a part I didn't like or understand, was curious about what he was offering. Come on, Connor, Brett said, extending his hand toward me in what looked like a friendly gesture. Just a quick look. We'll be back before the game is over. Your parents will never even know you were gone. I stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. It looked normal enough, clean fingernails, no obvious scars or marks, nothing that screamed danger. But something about it repulsed me on a level I couldn't articulate. The idea of touching him, of making any kind of physical contact, filled me with revulsion. I really can't, I said, continuing to back away. My dad is really strict about staying where he can see me. For just a moment, Brett's mask seemed to slip. His smile faltered slightly, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. It was gone so quickly that I might have imagined it, but the glimpse was enough to confirm what my instincts had been screaming all along. This person was dangerous. That's too bad, Brett said, his smile returning but not quite reaching his eyes this time. I was really hoping to share something special with you. The cabin is actually fascinating from a historical perspective, and the view from up there is incredible. You can see for miles in every direction. He gestured toward the tree line, and for the first time I noticed a faint path leading into the woods. It was barely visible, just a slight depression in the undergrowth that suggested people had walked that way before, but not recently. It's really just right over that first hill, Brett continued. 5 minutes up, 5 minutes to look around, 5 minutes back. Your parents would never even know you were gone. The repetition of that phrase, your parents would never even know you were gone, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Why was he so focused on making sure my parents wouldn't notice my absence? Why was that such an important part of his invitation? No, I said, more firmly this time. I'm going back to the game now. I turned and started walking toward the baseball field, my legs feeling shaky and uncertain beneath me. Every step felt like it took tremendous effort, as if I was walking through thick mud instead of across a level playground. Behind me, I could hear Brett's voice calling out, still maintaining that friendly tone, but with something else underneath it now. Something that sounded like frustration or anger, barely held in check. That's okay, Connor, he called after me. Maybe some other time. I'll probably be around this area quite a bit over the next few weeks. I'm sure we'll run into each other again. The threat in those words was subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't just saying goodbye. He was making a promise, or maybe a threat. The idea that he might be looking for me, waiting for another opportunity, made my knees weak with fear. I forced myself to keep walking, not looking back, focusing all my attention on reaching the safety of the baseball game and my parents. But with every step, I could feel his eyes on me, watching, evaluating, planning. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was whispering that this wasn't over. Despite my better judgment and the growing knot of fear in my stomach, I found myself slowing down before I reached the baseball field. Something about Brett's confident assertion that my parents hadn't been watching was nagging at me. When I finally turned to look back at the bleachers, my heart sank. He was right. My parents were completely absorbed in the game, leaning forward in their seats as Timothy prepared for what appeared to be a crucial pitch. My father was shouting encouragement that I couldn't hear over the distance, while my mother clutched her scorecard with white knuckles. Neither of them was even facing in my direction. The realization hit me like a physical blow. In their minds, I was probably still safely playing on the playground, supervised by the general presence of other families and the open, public nature of the space. They had no idea that I was now completely alone with a stranger who had been watching our family for who knows how long. When I turned back toward the playground, Brett was no longer sitting on the bench. For a moment, I felt a rush of relief, thinking that maybe he had given up and wandered off to find some other target for his attention. But then I spotted him, standing at the very edge of the tree line, right where that faint path disappeared into the woods. He was facing my direction, and even at that distance, I could see that he was smiling. But this wasn't the warm, friendly smile he had worn earlier. This was something else entirely. Predatory, confident, patient. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen next, and the most terrifying part was that he was right. Despite every rational thought in my head screaming at me to run back to my parents, despite the fear that was making my hand shake and my mouth taste like copper, I found myself walking back toward the playground. Each step felt like it was happening to someone else, as if I was watching myself from a distance, unable to intervene in my own terrible decision. "I knew you'd come back," Brett said when I was close enough to hear him clearly. His voice carried a note of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "You're exactly the kind of kid I thought you were. Curious, brave, mature enough to handle something really special. I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, though my voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Of course not," Brett replied with that same disturbing smile. "I wouldn't expect you to just trust a stranger. That would be dangerous, wouldn't it?" The fact that he was acknowledging the danger while simultaneously trying to lure me into it was deeply unsettling. It suggested a level of psychological sophistication that I wasn't equipped to handle, a kind of manipulation that was specifically designed to overcome a child's natural defenses. "But here's the thing, Connor," he continued, taking a step closer to the tree line and gesturing for me to follow. "I'm not really a stranger anymore, am I? We've been talking for almost an hour now. You know my name, I know yours. We've shared stories, had some laughs. That's what friends do." The word friends sent a chill down my spine. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way he used it, something that turned what should have been a warm, positive concept into something threatening and possessive. "Besides," Brett said, pointing into the woods, "I'm not asking you to go anywhere dangerous or isolated. That cabin I told you about, it's literally just over this hill. 5 minutes up, 5 minutes to look around, 5 minutes back. We'll be in sight of this field the whole time." I looked where he was pointing and realized that he might be telling the truth about the distance. The hill he was indicating wasn't particularly tall or steep, and the tree cover, while dense, wasn't impenetrable. If we really were only going a short distance, and if we really would be able to see the baseball field the whole time, then maybe it wouldn't be as dangerous as my instincts were telling me. "You can even tell your parents where you're going if you want," Brett added, as if reading my thoughts. "Go over there right now and let them know you're taking a quick walk in the woods with a friend. I'll wait right here." But we both knew I wasn't going to do that. If I told my parents what Brett was suggesting, they would shut it down immediately. No responsible adult would allow their 10-year-old child to wander off into the woods with a teenager they had never met, no matter how short the distance or how innocent the stated purpose. The fact that Brett was suggesting it, while knowing full well that I wouldn't actually do it, was another layer of manipulation. He was giving me an out that he knew I wouldn't take, which would make me feel like I was choosing to come with him rather than being coerced. "Come on," Brett said, his voice taking on a slightly impatient edge. "The sun's going to set soon, and then it really will be too dark to see anything. This is probably the only chance you'll get." He started walking slowly up the path, not looking back to see if I was following, but moving in a way that clearly expected me to come along. Each step he took into the woods seemed to pull at something inside me, like an invisible rope that was slowly drawing me forward against my will. I stood at the edge of the tree line for what felt like an eternity, my rational mind at war with forces I didn't understand. Everything logical told me to turn around, walk back to the baseball game, find my parents, and report what had happened. But something else, something that might have been curiosity or bravado or just the natural rebelliousness of childhood, was urging me to follow. "Connor," Brett called from about 20 feet up the path, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space of the woods. "You coming?" And God help me, I was. The first few steps into the woods felt like crossing an invisible barrier. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as soon as the canopy of leaves blocked out the direct sunlight. and the sounds of the baseball game became muffled and distant. The path was narrower than it had appeared from the playground, barely wide enough for one person, and lined with thorny bushes that seemed to reach out and grab at my clothes as I passed. Brett moved ahead of me with the confidence of someone who had walked this route many times before. He navigated around fallen logs and protruding roots without even looking down, his attention focused somewhere ahead that I couldn't see. Occasionally he would glance back at me with that same unsettling smile, as if checking to make sure I was still following. "This is actually a pretty interesting ecosystem," he said conversationally, as if we were on a nature walk rather than something that felt increasingly like a terrible mistake. "Lots of wildlife up here that you don't see down in the developed areas. Deer, wild turkeys, even the occasional black bear, though they usually stay away from people." The mention of bears sent a fresh spike of anxiety through my chest. I had never encountered a wild bear before, and the idea of running into one while alone in the woods with a near stranger was terrifying. "Don't worry," Brett said, apparently noticing my expression. "Bears are actually more afraid of you than you are of them. As long as you don't surprise them or get between a mother and her cubs, they'll usually just avoid you entirely." We continued climbing, the path growing steeper and more difficult with each step. My legs were starting to burn from the exertion, and I was beginning to breathe hard in the humid air. But Brett seemed unaffected by the climb, maintaining the same steady pace he had started with. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Not far now," Brett replied without turning around, "just over this next rise." But when we reached the top of what I thought was the final hill, I realized we weren't even close to our destination. Ahead of us, the path continued to wind through the trees, sometimes climbing, sometimes descending, but always leading deeper into the woods and further away from the safety of the baseball field. I stopped walking and looked back the way we had come. Through the trees, I could still see glimpses of the open field where the game was taking place, but it looked much further away than I had expected. The small figures of the players and spectators seemed impossibly distant, like looking at people through the wrong end of a telescope. "Brett," I called out, my voice cracking slightly with fear. "You said it was just over the hill. We've been walking for more than 5 minutes." He stopped and turned back to face me, and for a moment, his mask slipped completely. The friendly expression was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. But then, just as quickly, the smile returned. "Sorry, Connor," he said, his voice still maintaining that false warmth. "I guess I misjudged the distance a little bit. It's been a while since I've been up here. But we're really close now. Maybe just another 5 minutes. Another 5 minutes that would take us even deeper into the woods, even further from help, even more isolated from any potential witnesses or rescuers." The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn around and run, but somehow I couldn't make my legs obey the command. "I think I want to go back," I said, though my voice sounded small and uncertain. "Go back?" Brett asked, tilting his head with what looked like genuine surprise. "But we're so close, Connor. It would be a shame to come all this way and not see what we came for." He took a step closer to me, and I noticed for the first time how much larger he was than me. He wasn't exceptionally tall or muscular, but he was a teenager, and I was just a 10-year-old boy. If he decided he didn't want me to leave, there probably wasn't much I could do to stop him. "Besides," he continued, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "the path back down is tricky in some places. It would be safer if I went with you, and I really did want to show you this cabin first. It's truly something special." The implied threat was clear. He wasn't going to let me leave alone, and he wasn't ready to turn back yet. I was trapped in the woods with someone who had lied to me about where we were going and how long it would take to get there, someone who had been watching my family without our knowledge, someone who seemed far too interested in getting a 10-year-old boy alone and isolated, and the most terrifying realization of all was that my parents had no idea where I was or who I was with. If something happened to me up here, they wouldn't even know where to start looking. "Okay," I whispered, because what else could I say? "Just a quick look, and then we go back." Brett's smile widened, and this time there was no mistaking the predatory satisfaction in his expression. "Of course," he said, "just a quick look." The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from the dense foliage like something out of a nightmare. One moment we were walking through what seemed like endless forest, and the next we were standing in a small clearing where the trees had been cut back to make room for a structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was smaller than I had expected, maybe the size of a large garage, and built from logs that had weathered to a dark, almost black color. The roof sagged ominously in the middle, covered with moss and what looked like decades of accumulated leaves and debris. Several of the windows were broken, their glass hanging in jagged shards that caught the filtered sunlight like broken teeth. But what struck me most about the cabin wasn't its decrepit condition. It was the smell. Even from 20 feet away, I could detect an odor that made my stomach turn. It was a combination of rot and dampness, and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify, but that made every instinct in my body scream danger. "Well," Brett said, his voice carrying that same false cheerfulness that had become increasingly unsettling as our journey progressed. "Here we are. What do you think?" I thought it was the most terrifying place I had ever seen. There was something fundamentally wrong about the cabin, something that went beyond its obvious state of disrepair. It felt evil, if such a thing was possible for a building to feel. It radiated menace the way a fire radiates heat, creating an almost physical sensation of dread that made my skin crawl. "It's creepy," I managed to say, which was perhaps the greatest understatement of my young life. "Creepy is right," Brett agreed, but his tone suggested he found that quality appealing rather than disturbing. "Want to take a closer look?" Every fiber of my being wanted to say no, wanted to turn around and run back down that path as fast as my legs could carry me. But something about Brett's demeanor had changed since we'd arrived at the clearing. The pretense of friendly conversation had dropped away almost entirely, replaced by something more direct and intimidating. "I don't think so," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we should head back now. The game is probably almost over." Brett turned to look at me, and the expression on his face made my blood freeze in my veins. The mask of friendliness had been completely abandoned now, revealing something underneath that was cold and calculating and utterly without empathy. "Oh, I don't think we need to worry about the game," he said quietly. "I think we have plenty of time to explore." He started walking toward the cabin, not bothering to check if I was following, but something about his movement suggested he wasn't particularly worried about whether I came with him or not. Maybe because he knew there was nowhere for me to run, or maybe because he was confident that I wouldn't try to leave without him. As he approached the front door, which hung at an odd angle on rusted hinges, Brett reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the filtered sunlight. For a moment, I thought it might be a key. But as he got closer to the door, I realized it was something much more sinister. It was a knife. Not a large knife, nothing that would have been immediately threatening if I had seen it in any other context. Just a small folding knife, the kind that hunters or outdoorsmen might carry for utility purposes. But seeing it in Brett's hand, in this isolated location, with the way his entire demeanor had changed, transformed it into something genuinely terrifying. "Brett," I said, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper, "what are you doing?" He paused at the cabin door and looked back at me with what might have been amusement. "Just making sure we can get inside safely, Connor. Old buildings like this can be dangerous. Lots of rusty nails and unstable boards. I want to check it out first before you come in." But the way he held the knife, the way his fingers wrapped around it with obvious familiarity, suggested that he had much more experience with the tool than would be needed for simple building inspection. The cabin door opened with a shriek of protesting metal that echoed through the clearing like a scream. Even from where I stood, I could see into the dark interior of the building, and what I saw there made my knees go weak with terror. The inside of the cabin was a horror show. What had once been walls were now covered in dark stains that could have been rust or water damage but looked disturbingly like dried blood. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scattered papers, and what looked like pieces of clothing that had been torn and discarded. But most disturbing of all were the restraints. Chains hung from hooks driven into the log walls. Rope was coiled in corners like sleeping snakes, and in the center of the room, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the broken windows, was what looked like a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. God, I breathed, the word escaping my lips before I could stop it. Brett heard me and turned around, his expression a mixture of excitement and satisfaction. Pretty impressive, isn't it? This place has quite a history. We need to leave, I said, backing away from the cabin. Right now. We need to get out of here. Leave? Brett asked, tilting his head with mock confusion. But we just got here, Connor. Don't you want to see the inside? It's really quite fascinating from a historical perspective. He started walking toward me, the knife still in his hand, and I realized with growing horror that he had no intention of letting me leave. Whatever he had planned for this isolated cabin, whatever had happened to those other missing children he had mentioned, I was about to become part of that story. My parents know where I am, I lied desperately. They saw me leave with you. If I don't come back soon, they'll come looking for me. Brett laughed, and the sound was like ice water in my veins. Oh, Connor, we both know that's not true. Your parents are completely absorbed in that baseball game. They probably haven't even noticed you're gone yet. He was right, and we both knew it. I could be missing for another hour or more before my parents would start to worry, and even then, they would have no idea where to look for me. The path to this cabin was barely visible. The location was known only to Brett and whoever else had used this place for their horrible purposes. I was completely and utterly alone. Besides, Brett continued, moving closer with each word, even if they did come looking, they'd never find this place. I've been bringing kids up here for years, and nobody has ever found us. The casual way he said it, bringing kids up here for years, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a crime of opportunity. This was something he had done before, multiple times, with other children who had trusted him just like I had. Children who had probably never been seen again. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to Brett or to God or to the universe in general. Please don't do this. Brett stopped walking and studied my face with what looked like genuine curiosity. Don't do what, Connor? I haven't done anything yet. I've just brought you to see something interesting, just like I promised. But the knife in his hand and the horror show inside the cabin told a very different story. Whatever he was planning to do to me, whatever had happened to those other children, was about to begin, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. That's when I heard the sound that would save my life. The distant rumble of a truck engine growing closer through the woods, accompanied by men's voices shouting my name. Connor! Connor, where are you? Brett's head snapped toward the sound, his expression shifting from predatory confidence to something that looked like panic. The knife disappeared back into his pocket so quickly that I almost missed the movement. Shit, he muttered under his breath, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely worried. The voices were getting closer, and I could make out at least 2 different men calling my name. One of them sounded like my father, but I couldn't be sure over the distance and the interference of the trees. Connor, answer us if you can hear us. Brett looked at me with an expression that was equal parts fury and calculation. For a moment I thought he might try to grab me, to drag me into that nightmare cabin and hope that the searchers would miss us in the dense woods. But then the sound of the truck engine grew much louder, and we could both hear the crack and rustle of someone forcing their way through the underbrush, moving fast and with purpose. Another time, Brett said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made my skin crawl. This isn't over, Connor. And then he was gone, disappearing into the woods on the far side of the clearing with a speed and silence that suggested he had planned his escape route long before he had brought me to this place. I stood frozen in the clearing for what felt like an eternity, staring at the open door of that horrible cabin, unable to move or speak or even breathe properly. The reality of what had almost happened, what would have happened if those voices hadn't appeared when they did, was too enormous for my child's mind to fully process. Connor? The voice was definitely my father's now, close enough that I could hear the desperation and fear in it. I tried to call back to him, to let him know where I was, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. And then he was there, bursting into the clearing with the wild-eyed look of a parent who had been imagining the absolute worst. Behind him was Mr. Patterson, a grizzled Vietnam veteran who lived down the road from us and had apparently joined the search. My father's eyes took in the scene. Me standing alone in front of the horrifying cabin, no sign of anyone else, the clear evidence that something terrible had been interrupted, and his face went through a series of expressions that I would remember for the rest of my life. Relief at finding me safe, horror at what might have happened, and a cold, murderous rage directed at whoever had brought his child to this place. "Connor," he said, his voice shaking with emotion as he reached me and pulled me into his arms. "Thank God. Thank God you're okay." But as he held me, and as Mr. Patterson grimly examined the interior of the cabin with the professional eye of someone who had seen the worst that human beings were capable of, I knew that I wasn't really okay. I might be physically unharmed, but something inside me had been permanently changed by this experience. The innocence that had allowed me to trust a stranger's friendly smile was gone forever, replaced by a wariness that would color every interaction I had for the rest of my life. And somewhere out there, Brett was still free, still looking for his next victim, still planning to finish what he had started with me. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ride home from Millfield took place in almost complete silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio that my father had insisted on monitoring after we reported the incident to the local authorities. I sat wedged between my parents in the front seat of the pickup truck, my mother's arm wrapped around me so tightly that it was almost difficult to breathe. But I didn't complain. The physical contact felt like the only thing anchoring me to reality. Every few minutes, my father would glance over at me with an expression that mixed relief with barely contained rage. I could see him struggling with questions he wanted to ask, but wasn't sure I was ready to answer. My mother, meanwhile, seemed to be operating under the assumption that if she held me close enough, she could somehow undo whatever psychological damage had been done in those woods. The police had taken the incident seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. Detective Morrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that was probably developed specifically for dealing with traumatized children, had spent nearly an hour asking me questions about Brett's appearance, his manner of speaking, and any details I could remember about our conversation. But when it came to describing what I had seen inside that cabin, I found myself struggling to find words. How do you explain to adults that you've looked into the face of pure evil? How do you convey the bone-deep certainty that terrible things had happened in that place, and that you had come within minutes, maybe seconds, of becoming part of that history? The boy mentioned that this person claimed to have brought other children to this location, Detective Morrison had said to my father, speaking quietly, but not so quietly that I couldn't hear every word. "We're going to need to process that cabin as a potential crime scene. It's going to take some time." The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. If Brett had been telling the truth about bringing other children to the cabin, if those restraints and stains inside the building were what they appeared to be, then this was much bigger than just my near miss with a potential predator. "How many other children?" my mother had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Morrison had looked uncomfortable. "We don't know yet, ma'am. We'll need to compare this location with our files on missing persons cases, check with other jurisdictions in the area. It's going to be a lengthy investigation." Now, as we drove through the gathering dusk toward home, I found myself thinking about those other children Brett had mentioned. The ones who had disappeared from the playground over the years. The ones who had been found changed and traumatized. The ones who had never been found at all. Had they all started their ordeal the same way I had, with a friendly stranger who told scary stories and offered to show them something special? Had they all ignored their instincts and followed someone they should have run from? "Connor," my father said suddenly, breaking the long silence. "I need you to understand something. What happened today? It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. If I had listened to my instincts, if I had run when every cell in my body was telling me to run, none of this would have happened. The police wouldn't be processing a crime scene. My parents wouldn't be traumatized. And maybe, if I had reported Brett earlier, some other child wouldn't become his next victim. "Your father's right," my mother added, her voice thick with emotion. "That man was a predator, Connor. Predators are experts at manipulating children, at making them feel special and mature and chosen. It's not your fault that you trusted him." But even as she said it, I could hear the unspoken questions in her voice. How had they not noticed that I was gone? How had they been so absorbed in a baseball game that they missed their child disappearing with a stranger? What kind of parents were they if they couldn't even keep their 10-year-old safe at a public park? The guilt wasn't just mine to bear. My parents were carrying their own heavy load of what-ifs and if-onlys, and I could see it weighing them down with every mile we traveled. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the familiar sight of our small farmhouse should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt exposed and vulnerable. The woods that bordered our property, which had always seemed friendly and inviting, now looked dark and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding someone watching our house, waiting for another opportunity. "I think we should call your brother," my mother said to my father as we climbed the front porch steps. "Timothy's going to want to know what happened." Timothy. In all the chaos and fear of the afternoon, I had completely forgotten about my older brother. The baseball game that had started this whole nightmare seemed like it had happened days ago, rather than just a few hours. Timothy's team had probably won or lost by now, and he was probably wondering why his family had disappeared before the game was over. "He's staying overnight at the coach's house tonight," my father reminded her. "Team bonding or some such. We'll call him in the morning." I was grateful for the reprieve. The thought of having to explain to Timothy what had happened, of seeing the look in his eyes when he realized how close he had come to losing his little brother, was more than I could handle at the moment. Inside the house, my mother immediately began what could only be described as nervous, busy work. She started cooking a dinner none of us would have any appetite for, cleaning kitchen counters that were already spotless, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. It was her way of processing trauma, staying in motion, keeping her hands busy, maintaining the illusion that normal domestic activities could somehow restore normalcy to our lives. My father, meanwhile, had taken on the role of security chief. He walked through the house, checking every door and window lock, testing the batteries in our smoke detectors, and generally inspecting our home's defenses as if he expected an imminent attack, which, given what had happened, didn't seem entirely unreasonable. As for me, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the tree line beyond our backyard, wondering if Brett was out there somewhere watching our house. Detective Morrison had assured us that every law enforcement agency in a 50-mile radius had been given Brett's description and would be looking for him, but that didn't make me feel any safer. Predators like Brett didn't just give up and move on when one of their plans was interrupted. They adapted. They learned. They found new ways to get what they wanted. "Connor," my father said, pulling up a chair beside me at the table, "I know today was scary, and I know you're probably going to have a lot of questions and feelings about what happened, but I want you to know that you can talk to us about anything at all, Miragas." I nodded, though I wasn't sure that was true. How could I explain to my parents that I felt fundamentally changed by what had happened? That the world looked different now, darker and more dangerous than it had just that morning? That I was afraid I would never feel truly safe again? "The detective mentioned that they might want to talk to you again in a few days," my mother said, joining us at the table with 3 cups of hot chocolate that none of us had asked for. "After they've had a chance to process the crime scene and see what they find." Crime scene. The words sent a fresh chill through me. That cabin wasn't just an abandoned building where a disturbed teenager told scary stories. It was a place where real crimes had been committed, where real children had suffered, where I had almost become another victim in a pattern of abuse that might have been going on for years. "What if they don't catch him?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest since we left the woods. My parents exchanged a look that told me they had been wondering the same thing. "They'll catch him," my father said with more confidence than I think he actually felt. "Mr. Patterson got a good look at him when he was running away. The police have a detailed description, and now they know about the cabin, which means they can watch for him there." But I knew, with the terrible certainty that comes from having looked evil in the face, that Brett was too smart to go back to that cabin. He would find another location, develop another method, target other children who didn't have the benefit of knowing what he was capable of. "He said he'd been bringing kids there for years," I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. My parents sat frozen, as if saying anything might somehow make that horrible possibility more real than it already was. Finally, my mother reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. Connor, honey, you don't need to think about that. You don't need to carry that burden. That's for the police to worry about. But I was thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Somewhere out there were parents who had never found their children, families destroyed by a predator who had perfected his methods over years of practice. And I was one of the lucky ones. I had gotten away. The thought made me feel guilty in a way I couldn't fully understand. Why had I been saved when others hadn't? What made me special enough to deserve rescue when other children had presumably faced their fate alone in that horrible cabin? I think, my father said slowly, that we should consider talking to someone, a counselor maybe, someone who specializes in helping children process traumatic experiences. The suggestion should have felt like defeat, like an admission that I was too weak to handle what had happened on my own. Instead, it felt like relief. The idea that there were people who understood trauma, who could help me make sense of the feelings I was struggling with, was more comforting than I had expected. I think that's a good idea, I said quietly. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful but instead looked ominous. Night was coming, and with it all the fears and uncertainties that darkness brings to a child who has just learned that the world is full of people who want to hurt him. But inside our house, surrounded by my family, with locks on the doors and Detective Morrison's business card on the refrigerator, I felt something that might have been the beginning of safety. It wasn't much. It wasn't nearly enough to erase what had happened or to guarantee that nothing like it would ever happen again. But it was a start. 3 days later, Detective Morrison called our house with news that turned my blood to ice. The crime scene investigators had finished their preliminary examination of the cabin, and what they had found was worse than anyone had imagined. I listened from the top of the stairs as my parents took the call in the kitchen, their voices growing more strained and horrified with each piece of information the detective shared. Even from that distance, even hearing only one side of the conversation, the details that filtered up to me painted a picture of systematic horror that would haunt my dreams for years to come. "How many?" my mother asked at one point, her voice breaking on the words. The silence that followed was answer enough. When my father finally spoke again, his voice was hollow and shaken in a way I had never heard before. "Dear God," he whispered, "how long has this been going on?" The investigators had found evidence linking the cabin to at least 7 missing children cases spanning a period of nearly 5 years. DNA evidence, personal belongings, and other forensic materials that painted a picture of predation on a scale that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what they had found in a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's floorboards, a collection of photographs and journals that documented Brett's crimes in meticulous detail. The photographs, Detective Morrison explained, were too graphic and disturbing to be described, but the journals revealed a mind that was not only deeply disturbed, but also methodical and organized in its approach to victimizing children. "The journals indicate that he's been operating in this area for several years," Detective Morrison told my parents. "He appears to have a pattern of targeting children at public events, baseball games, county fairs, school functions, places where families gather and parents might be distracted. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Friendly older teenager approaches group of children, tells scary stories to capture their attention, isolates one child from the group, lures them away with promises of adventure or special attention. And then, the cabin. We believe Connor was extremely fortunate," the detective continued. "Based on what we found at the scene, this individual's interactions with previous victims were extensive. The fact that Connor was rescued before any physical harm occurred is nothing short of miraculous." My mother's soft sobbing drifted up the stairs, punctuated by my father's attempts to comfort her. I knew they were both thinking the same thing I was, how close I had come to becoming just another entry in Brett's journal, another photograph in his collection, another family destroyed by his sickness. "What about the suspect?" my father asked. "Any leads on his whereabouts?" The answer was frustratingly vague. Despite an intensive manhunt involving multiple law enforcement agencies, Brett had seemingly vanished without a trace. His description had been circulated to every police department, sheriff's office, and federal agency in the region, but so far there had been no confirmed sightings. "We believe he's still in the area," Detective Morrison said. "Predators like this rarely abandon a territory they've been successfully operating in for years. He's more likely to lay low for a while and then resume his activities when he thinks the heat has died down." The thought that Brett was still out there, still hunting, still looking for opportunities to hurt children, made me feel sick to my stomach. Every time I left the house, every time I saw a teenager with curly brown hair, every time I heard a voice that sounded even remotely similar to his, my heart would race and my hands would start to shake. "We're going to need Connor to work with a police sketch artist," the detective continued. "We have Mr. Patterson's description from when he saw the suspect fleeing, but Connor spent the most time with him. His input could be crucial to creating an accurate composite." The idea of having to relive that afternoon in enough detail to help create a picture of Brett's face was terrifying, but I knew it was necessary. If there was any chance that my memories could help catch him before he hurt another child, I had to try. The sketch session was scheduled for the following morning at the police station, and I spent that night lying awake, trying to prepare myself mentally for what would be required. I would have to remember every detail of Brett's appearance, every nuance of his expressions, every characteristic that might help someone recognize him. But more than that, I would have to remember the sound of his voice, the way his demeanor had changed as we walked deeper into the woods, the moment when his mask had finally slipped completely and I had seen him for what he really was. The next morning, my parents drove me to the police station in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken fears. The building was smaller than I had expected. Just a single-story brick structure that looked more like a school administrative office than the headquarters of a major criminal investigation. Detective Morrison met us in the lobby and led us to a small conference room where a woman named Sandra Walsh was waiting with a large sketch pad and an array of pencils. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of calm, professional demeanor that suggested she had spent years helping traumatized witnesses reconstruct the faces of people who had hurt them. "Connor," she said with a gentle smile, "I know this might be difficult, but I want you to know that you're helping us do something very important. The picture we create together could help protect other children." The process was more intensive than I had anticipated. Sandra started with basic facial structure, the shape of Brett's head, the set of his jaw, the general proportions of his features. Then we moved on to specific details, the exact shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose, the texture and pattern of his curly hair. Each element required multiple attempts and revisions. Sandra would sketch something based on my description, show it to me, and then make adjustments based on my feedback. A little rounder. The eyes were closer together. The hair was curlier in the front. As the face began to take shape on the paper, I felt a growing sense of unease. Seeing Brett's features emerge under Sandra's skilled pencil made him real again in a way that was almost unbearable. It was like summoning a demon, calling him back into existence through the act of remembering. "How are we doing?" Sandra asked after about an hour of work. "Does this look like the person you remember?" I stared at the sketch, and my breath caught in my throat. It was him. Not perfect. No sketch could capture the subtle expressions and mannerisms that had made Brett so unnervingly convincing, but unmistakably the face of the person who had tried to lure me to that cabin. "That's him," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Detective Morrison leaned in to examine the sketch, his expression grim. "This is excellent work, Connor. Really excellent. We'll get this out to every law enforcement agency in the state within the next few hours." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Brett had managed to operate undetected for years, victimizing multiple children without being caught. A sketch, no matter how accurate, was just one tool in an investigation that was proving frustratingly difficult. "Detective," my father said, "what are the chances that you'll actually catch this guy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Detective Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how honest to be in front of a 10-year-old who had already been traumatized enough. "We're doing everything we can," he finally said. "But I have to be honest with you. Predators like this are often very skilled at avoiding detection. They're intelligent, they plan carefully, and they're motivated by drives that most of us can't understand." He paused, looking directly at me. "But Connor, I want you to know that what you did today, helping us create this sketch, could make all the difference. Sometimes it's the smallest details that break a case wide open. As we left the police station, sketch completed and my part in the official investigation finished, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that I had done everything I could to help, fear that it wouldn't be enough, and a growing certainty that this was far from over. Brett was still out there, still hunting, still perfecting his methods. And somewhere, probably not too far away, there was another child who would soon face the same choice I had faced. Trust a friendly stranger's invitation, or listen to the voice inside that whispers danger. I could only hope that when that moment came, that child would be luckier than I had been, or that the sketch we had created would help ensure that Brett never got the chance to approach another victim. But deep down, in the part of my mind that had been forever changed by that afternoon in the woods, I knew that evil like Brett's doesn't simply disappear because a sketch has been drawn or an investigation has been launched. It adapts, it waits, it finds new ways to accomplish its goals, and it never, ever gives up. 6 months later, I still check the locks on my bedroom windows every night before going to sleep. The counseling sessions with Dr. Patricia Henley had helped tremendously. She specialized in childhood trauma and had given me tools for managing the anxiety and hypervigilance that had become constant companions since that day at the baseball field. But no amount of therapy could completely erase the knowledge that Brett was still out there, somewhere, still hunting. The investigation had gone cold by October. Despite the sketch, despite the evidence found at the cabin, despite the coordinated efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies, Brett had simply vanished. Detective Morrison called our house once a month with updates that were really just confirmations that there were no updates, no sightings, no new leads, no breaks in the case. These things can take time, he would tell my parents during these calls, sometimes years. But we haven't given up, and we're not going to give up. But I could hear the frustration in his voice, the professional disappointment of an experienced investigator who knew that with each passing day, the chances of catching Brett grew smaller. Cold cases had a way of staying cold, especially when the perpetrator was intelligent enough to change his patterns and disciplined enough to lay low. The worst part was the not knowing. Was he still in the area, watching and waiting for the investigation to lose steam? Had he moved on to some other region where he could start fresh with new victims? Or was he simply biding his time, confident that he could eventually resume his activities in familiar territory? I had started having dreams about him, not nightmares exactly, but vivid scenarios where I would spot him in crowded places and try to alert authorities, only to watch him disappear into crowds of people who couldn't or wouldn't see what I was seeing. In these dreams, I was always the only one who recognized him, the only one who understood the danger he represented. Dr. Henley said these dreams were a manifestation of what she called survivor's responsibility. The feeling that because I had escaped, I was somehow obligated to protect other potential victims. She assured me that these feelings were normal and would fade with time, but I wasn't so sure. The truth was, I did feel responsible. Every time I saw a news story about a missing child, every time I heard about suspicious activity at a school or park, I wondered if Brett was involved. I wondered if there was something more I could have done, some detail I had forgotten that might have helped the investigation. My family had adapted to our new reality in different ways. My mother had become fiercely protective, insisting on knowing exactly where I was at all times and requiring check-ins that probably seemed excessive to my friends' parents. My father had channeled his anger into advocacy, volunteering with organizations that work to prevent child abduction and educate families about predatory behavior. Timothy, who had been devastated when he learned what had happened, had appointed himself my unofficial bodyguard. He walked me to and from school, vetted my friends with the intensity of a Secret Service agent, and made it clear to everyone in our small town that anyone who wanted to mess with his little brother would have to go through him first. But perhaps the biggest change was in me. The boy who had trustingly followed a stranger into the woods was gone, replaced by someone who questioned motives, analyzed interactions, and maintained a constant state of wariness that was exhausting but necessary. I had learned to read people differently, to notice the subtle signs that Dr. Henley had taught me to recognize. The way someone paid too much attention to children. The person who seemed just a little too interested in learning details about family routines. The adult who tried to create situations where they would be alone with kids. It was a skill set I never wanted to have, but one that might save my life, or someone else's, someday. The 1-year anniversary of the incident came and went without fanfare. I had hoped that reaching that milestone might bring some sense of closure, but instead, it just reminded me how long Brett had been free to continue his activities elsewhere. Detective Morrison called that day with what he probably thought was encouraging news. The case had been featured on a national television program about unsolved crimes, and they had received several tips from viewers who thought they might have seen Brett in various locations across the country. Most of these tips don't pan out, he admitted, but it only takes one. We're following up on every single lead. But I could hear in his voice that even he was starting to lose hope. A year was a long time in law enforcement terms. Budgets were tight, resources were limited, and there were always new cases demanding attention. The investigation into Brett would continue, but it would no longer be a priority. As I entered my sophomore year of high school, I had largely learned to live with the uncertainty. The daily fear had subsided into something more manageable, a background awareness that never quite went away, but no longer dominated my every waking moment. I had even started dating, though I found it difficult to trust new people and tended to stick with friends I had known since childhood. Sarah Martinez, whose family had moved to town the year after the incident, had been patient with my quirks and protective instincts, though I had never told her the full story of why I was the way I was. It was during our junior year that I got the call that changed everything. I was studying for a chemistry test when my father answered the phone in the kitchen. I heard him say, "Detective Morrison," and immediately stopped what I was doing to listen. "When?" my father asked, his voice sharp with sudden attention. The conversation continued for several minutes, but I could only hear my father's side of it. "Are you sure it's him? Where? What happens now?" When he finally hung up the phone, I was already standing in the kitchen doorway, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. "They caught him," my father said quietly. "They caught Brett." The details came out slowly over the next few days. Brett had been arrested in a small town in Ohio, caught in the act of trying to lure a 12-year-old boy away from a youth soccer tournament. But this time, the child had been smart enough to immediately run to his parents, and alert security guards had spotted Brett fleeing the scene. When police apprehended him 3 blocks away, they found items in his car that linked him not only to the Indiana cabin, but to similar crimes in 4 other states. DNA evidence, personal belongings from victims, and most damning of all, an updated journal that documented his activities during the 3 years he had been on the run. "He never stopped," Detective Morrison told my family during a conference call. "Based on what we're finding, he continued his pattern in multiple locations. We believe there are at least 6 additional victims across Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia." The news should have felt like victory, like vindication, like the closure I'd been seeking for years. Instead, it felt like a punch to the gut. While I had been going to therapy and learning to manage my trauma, Brett had been destroying other families, traumatizing other children, adding new entries to his collection of horror. 6 more victims. 6 more families torn apart because a monster had been allowed to roam free. "Connor," Detective Morrison said, his voice gentle but serious, "we're going to need you to testify at his trial. Your case was the first one where we have a living witness who can describe his methods, his approach, the psychological manipulation he uses. Your testimony could be crucial to ensuring he never has the opportunity to hurt another child." The prospect of facing Brett in a courtroom, of having to relive that day in front of a jury and a judge, and the man who had tried to destroy my childhood, was terrifying, but it was also necessary. "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. "Whatever you need me to do." The trial took place 8 months later in a federal courthouse in Cincinnati. Brett had been charged under federal statutes related to the transportation of minors across state lines for criminal purposes, which meant the death penalty was on the table. Seeing him again after all those years was surreal. He looked older, thinner, his curly brown hair now showing streaks of gray, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, utterly without remorse or empathy. When he looked at me during my testimony, I saw no recognition, no acknowledgement of the trauma he had caused. To him, I was just another witness, another obstacle to overcome, another problem to be managed. My testimony lasted for 2 full days. I described in excruciating detail the events of that afternoon, the psychological manipulation Brett had used, the horror I had seen inside that cabin. I spoke about the years of therapy, the nightmares, the way the experience had fundamentally changed how I viewed the world and other people. The defense attorney tried to discredit my memory, suggesting that the trauma had distorted my recollection of events, that I was an unreliable witness whose testimony had been contaminated by years of therapy and media exposure. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the similarities between my experience and the accounts of other victims created a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. On the final day of the trial, Brett's attorney offered to have him plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The prosecution accepted, sparing the victims' families the trauma of a lengthy sentencing phase and ensuring that Brett would never again have the opportunity to hurt a child. As the judge read the sentence, multiple life terms to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the peace of moving on, but the peace that comes from knowing that justice has been served and that a monster can no longer hurt innocent people. Brett was led away in shackles, his head down, his confident demeanor finally broken. As he passed the section where victim families were seated, he glanced up once, and our eyes met for a brief moment. In that instant, I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. For the first time since I had known him, Brett looked like what he really was: a broken, pathetic human being who would spend the rest of his life in a concrete box, forgotten by the world except as a cautionary tale. "It's over," my father said as we left the courthouse, his arm around my shoulders. And for the first time in 7 years, I believed him. The nightmares didn't stop immediately. The hypervigilance took months to fade. The trust issues would probably never completely disappear. But the knowledge that Brett was locked away forever, that he would never again have the opportunity to destroy a family or steal a child's innocence, was enough to begin the real healing process. I graduated from high school the following spring, went on to college, and eventually became a social worker specializing in child protection services. The boy who had once trustingly followed a stranger into the woods had grown into a man whose life's work was protecting other children from predators like Brett. Detective Morrison retired a few years after the trial, but we still exchange Christmas cards. In his last note, he told me that the investigation into Brett's crimes had led to the closure of 17 cold cases across 6 states, bringing closure to families who had been wondering about their missing children for years. "None of those families would have gotten answers if you hadn't been brave enough to testify," he wrote. "You saved a lot of people from a lifetime of not knowing." I keep that card in my office, along with the original police sketch that Sandra Walsh had created from my memories. They serve as reminders of how close I came to being another statistic, another missing child poster, another family destroyed by evil. But they also remind me that evil, no matter how clever or patient or determined, can be defeated by ordinary people who refuse to give up, who insist on justice, and who are willing to stand up and say, "This happened to me, and it was wrong, and it must never happen again." Brett died in prison in 2018, stabbed by another inmate who had learned about his crimes. I felt no satisfaction when I heard the news, just a quiet sense that the world had become a slightly safer place. The boy I was that summer day in 1987 is gone forever, replaced by scars and wisdom that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But that boy's courage in the face of unimaginable evil, his willingness to trust his instincts when it mattered most, and his determination to help bring a monster to justice, those things live on. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. The evil that stalks children in playgrounds and parks and public places hasn't disappeared with Brett's death. There are others out there, using the same methods, targeting the same vulnerabilities, counting on the same assumptions that led me into those woods all those years ago. But there are also more people watching now, more families educated about the warning signs, more children taught to trust their instincts and run when something feels wrong. The fight against evil is never really over. But sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, you get to win a battle that matters. And sometimes, that's enough to make all the nightmares worthwhile. The boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan stretched endlessly before Cameron Walsh as he adjusted his heavy backpack. 34 years old and desperate for solitude after his messy divorce, he'd chosen this remote section of Prince Albert National Park for its isolation and pristine wilderness. No cell service, no tourists, just the ancient pines and the promise of peace. 2 weeks alone, Cam muttered to himself as he consulted his topographical map. 2 weeks to clear my head. The late September air carried the first whispers of autumn, crisp and clean. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with each breeze. Despite the serenity, something felt different. In his 15 years of solo backpacking, Cam had developed what his friends called a wilderness intuition. Today, that intuition prickled uncomfortably at the back of his neck. The trail had disappeared nearly 2 hours ago. Now he navigated by compass and map alone, pushing deeper into territory few hikers ever ventured. According to his research, the nearest human dwelling was over 30 miles south. He was utterly alone, or should have been. The first anomaly came that afternoon. While setting up camp near a small stream, Cam discovered unusually large tracks in the soft mud of the bank. Too large for a black bear, too wide for a moose. The impressions were deep, suggesting significant weight, with 5 distinct toe marks at the front of each print. "What the hell made these?" he whispered, crouching to examine them. The prints were fresh, perhaps only hours old. As daylight faded, Cam built his fire larger than usual, the flames casting long shadows among the trees. Something about those tracks had disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He'd heard stories, of course. Every serious backpacker had. Tales whispered by locals in small-town diners, posts on obscure wilderness forums about encounters in remote forests like this one. Just bears, he assured himself as he prepared his freeze-dried dinner. Weird prints, but definitely bear. The forest grew unnaturally quiet as darkness fell. No chirping insects, no rustling nocturnal creatures. Just silence, broken only by the occasional crack of his campfire. At 2:17 a.m., Cam jolted awake in his tent. He hadn't dreamed. Something had woken him. He lay perfectly still, listening. Then he heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling his campsite. Slow, methodical. The sound of something large moving with surprising stealth. And underneath that sound, barely perceptible, breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that didn't belong to any animal Cam recognized. Morning revealed nothing. No prints, no disturbed gear. Yet Cam couldn't shake the certainty that something had visited his camp. He packed quickly, eager to move deeper into the wilderness, where he'd planned to establish his main base camp near Alpine Lake. The day's hike took him through increasingly dense forest. Several times he paused, certain he'd glimpsed movement in his peripheral vision. Just flashes of something large and dark slipping between distant trees. But each time he turned, nothing was there. Getting jumpy already, he chided himself. Day 2 and already seeing things. By mid-afternoon, he reached his destination. Alpine Lake stretched before him, its surface reflecting the surrounding pines and distant mountains. It was perfect, secluded, beautiful, with fresh water and natural shelter provided by a small rocky overhang. As he set up his base camp, Cam noticed broken branches high in the surrounding trees, 15 feet up or higher. Too high for a bear. The breaks appeared fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored and unwithered. Despite his growing unease, he forced himself to follow his routine, setting up his tent, collecting firewood, filtering water from the lake. Structure and logic were his anchors. There were rational explanations for everything he'd observed. That night, he recorded his thoughts in his journal. Day 2. Alpine Lake. Something's off about these woods. Tracks too big for known wildlife, breaking branches too high for bears. Keep hearing movement just beyond visual range. Most disturbing is the feeling of being watched constantly. We'll reassess tomorrow if conditions continue. He just closed his journal when he heard it. A long, mournful sound somewhere between a howl and a deep, resonant whoop that echoed across the lake. It repeated 3 times, each call lasting nearly 10 seconds. The sound didn't match any animal Cam knew, and he'd studied wilderness survival extensively. More unsettling was what happened next. From the distant hills came responses, 2 distinct calls answering the first. Whatever had made that sound wasn't alone. Cam added more wood to his fire and retrieved his hunting knife from his pack. He didn't own a gun, had never felt the need for one until this moment. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and plagued by dreams of being pursued through endless trees by something he couldn't quite see. He woke at dawn to find his carefully stacked firewood scattered and, most alarmingly, his food bag missing from where he'd hung it 15 feet high between two pines. "This isn't happening," Cam muttered as he surveyed his campsite. The missing food was a serious problem. He had emergency rations in his pack, enough for maybe 3 days, but not the 2 weeks he'd planned. He would need to either forage extensively or cut his trip short, but it was the method of theft that truly unnerved him. The rope holding his food bag hadn't been cut. It had been untied and carefully rehung, empty. Whatever took his supplies had the dexterity to untie complex knots. As he contemplated his options, he noticed something new. A crude arrangement of stones on the lakeshore that hadn't been there the previous evening. 12 rocks placed in a rough circle with 3 larger stones in the center. It looked deliberately placed, a message or warning of some kind. Time to go, Cam decided, his heart pounding. This isn't wildlife, this is something else. He began packing hastily but stopped when he realized a critical problem. He wasn't entirely sure which direction he'd come from. His detailed topographical map was in his food bag, now gone. His backup compass showed north, but without landmarks or his map. Finding the trail back would be challenging. Focus, he told himself. South and slightly east. Follow the drainage. You'll hit the marked trail eventually. By noon, Cam was pushing through dense underbrush, keeping the sun on his left as he moved what he hoped was south. The forest seemed to have changed overnight. Trails he thought he recognized led nowhere. Landmarks appeared unfamiliar. Several times he discovered those same large humanoid tracks, now seemingly fresh. "Hello?" he called out, wondering if perhaps other hikers were playing an elaborate prank. "Is someone there?" His voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest. The only response was an unnatural silence, the birds and insects falling quiet as his voice faded. That's when he spotted it. Standing motionless between 2 distant trees was a figure, tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark hair or fur. Though mostly obscured by foliage, its outline was unmistakably bipedal. It made no sound, no movement. Just watched. Cam froze, his breath catching. For nearly a minute, neither moved. Then slowly the figure stepped backward, maintaining eye contact until it disappeared into the shadows of the forest. With hands shaking violently, Cam pulled out his phone to take a photo, forgetting momentarily it had died days ago. Cursing, he shoved it back in his pocket and resumed walking, now at a much faster pace. By late afternoon, he realized he was lost. The sun was getting low, and he'd been walking for hours with no sign of the trail. Worse, he'd begun to suspect he was being herded, subtly guided away from certain areas by strategically placed broken branches and stone arrangements that appeared with increasing frequency. With no choice but to make camp again, he selected a small clearing, gathering what little deadwood he could find. The fire he built was smaller than he'd like, but it would have to do. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches breaking in the distance, heavy footfalls that stopped and started, and most disturbing, what sounded like low, murmuring voices just beyond the firelight. At some point during that endless night, as Cam huddled by his dwindling fire, the stalking became overt. They, for he was now certain there were at least 3, began circling his camp. Keeping to the shadows, they moved with a coordination that suggested intelligence and purpose. Occasionally, one would strike a tree trunk powerfully, creating a booming sound that reverberated through the forest. Another would answer from a different direction. They were communicating, coordinating. "I'm not here to harm anything," Cam called out, his voice cracking. "I'm just passing through." His words were met with sudden, complete silence, then a barrage of wood knocks erupting from all directions, so loud and numerous he covered his ears. In the brief illumination of his headlamp, he caught glimpses. Massive fur-covered limbs, glinting, reflective eyes. Once, a full silhouette, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, standing upright on 2 legs at the edge of the darkness. Near dawn, exhausted and terrified, Cam made a decision. He would leave everything except water and essential survival gear. Moving light and fast, he might cover enough ground to reach civilization. As the first gray light filtered through the trees, he prepared to implement his plan, only to discover his boots were missing. They'd been taken silently from where he'd left them beside his sleeping bag. A primitive message. You're not going anywhere. From a nearby ridge came that same haunting call he'd heard the first night, a sound that raised goosebumps across his entire body. Using strips torn from his backpack, Cam bound extra socks around his feet. A poor substitute for hiking boots, but they would have to do. With his knife in hand and emergency rations stuffed in his pockets, he abandoned his camp and began moving quickly downhill, following a small stream that had to eventually lead to lower elevations and possibly people. The pursuit began almost immediately, heavy crashes through the underbrush behind him, guttural vocalizations that couldn't be mistaken for any known animal. They weren't hiding anymore. They were actively chasing. Cam ran, scrambling over fallen logs and through shallow ravines, his makeshift footwear quickly shredding on the rough terrain. His lungs burned, and his feet began bleeding, but terror drove him forward. When he reached a steep embankment above a rocky creek bed, he lost his footing. The fall was only about 15 feet, but he landed badly, feeling something snap in his ankle. White-hot pain shot up his leg as he tried to stand. Hobbling now, he managed another quarter-mile before accepting the inevitable. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them. His only hope was somehow making peace, or hiding well enough to escape detection. Selecting a dense thicket, he crawled inside, covering himself with fallen leaves and forest debris. And there, curled in a fetal position with his useless knife clutched to his chest, Cameron Walsh waited for whatever would come next. Night fell. Cam's broken ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, throbbing in time with his racing heart. From his hiding place, he watched as bobbing lights appeared in the distance, flashlights moving in a coordinated search pattern. "Here! Over here!" he shouted, certain these must be park rangers or rescue personnel. The lights immediately converged on his location. Relief flooded through him, until the flashlight beams revealed their holders. They weren't human. 3 massive figures surrounded his hiding place. In the harsh illumination, he could now see them clearly. 8 feet tall at minimum, powerfully built, covered in matted reddish-brown hair. Their faces were startlingly expressive, almost human-like, but with pronounced brow ridges and wide, flat noses. Most disturbing were their eyes, dark and unmistakably intelligent. They carried his flashlights, tools they'd clearly figured out how to use. The largest of the 3 crouched down, its face now just feet from Cam's. Its breath smelled of raw meat and wild herbs. For endless seconds, they stared at each other. Then, with surprising gentleness, the creature reached out and touched Cam's injured ankle. He flinched but didn't pull away. What happened next defied everything Cam thought he knew about the natural world. The 3 beings worked together with obvious purpose. The largest lifted him carefully, cradling him like a child, while the others gathered materials, branches, moss, what looked like medicinal plants. They carried him to a cave he hadn't noticed before, its entrance hidden behind a natural formation of fallen trees. Inside, a fire already burned in a well-established pit. Other creatures, smaller ones, possibly juveniles, moved back as he was brought in and placed on a bed of soft pine boughs. One applied a poultice of chewed plants to his ankle, while another offered him what appeared to be dried meat and berries. Despite his fear, hunger overtook him, and he ate. For 3 days they kept him in that cave. They treated his injury, brought him food and clean water, but never allowed him to leave. They communicated among themselves with an elaborate system of vocalizations, gestures, and facial expressions that suggested a complex language. On the 4th day, the largest one, whom Cam had begun thinking of as the leader, gestured for him to follow. His ankle, while not healed, had improved enough for him to walk with the help of a makeshift staff they'd provided. They led him through the forest, traveling primarily at night. The journey took 2 more days, during which Cam observed their social structure, their hunting techniques, their obvious intelligence. They weren't animals, but they weren't human either. They existed in some extraordinary middle ground science hadn't acknowledged. Finally, they stopped. Through a break in the trees, Cam could see distant lights, a small town or outpost. The leader made a pushing motion toward the lights, then a sweeping gesture back toward the forest. The message was clear: go there, don't come back. As dawn approached, They disappeared silently into the trees, leaving him alone at the forest's edge. He found himself on a marked hiking trail with a signpost indicating the ranger station was just 2 miles ahead. Before beginning that final leg of his journey, Cam turned back toward the darkened forest. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed eyes watching from the shadows, that same intelligent gaze that had both terrified and fascinated him. "I understand," he said quietly. "Your secret is safe." Then he turned and limped toward civilization, already composing in his mind the story he would tell, a simple tale of getting lost, injuring himself, and surviving on his emergency supplies until finding the trail again. The truth would remain in the forest, where it belonged. Would you like me to explain any part of the story in more detail?